parable. So when I say it's a parable, it's whether it's mythical, whether it's real, what matters is that you get whatever lesson you need to get from it. Okay, so here's another parable for you. There was once a human entity, just like you and me. It could be either a man or a woman, but for the sake of simplicity, we're going to call this entity a him. His name is Sheman. In a location in the middle of the desert, the clouds are dark and a flash of lightning sears the earth plain. The lightning bolt had a mission, and it was to deposit one human entity right in the middle of this barren land. Sheman materialized in the spot where the bolt struck. He looked around and no remembrance of how or why he was here. Ever felt like that? He had no memories of past, present, or future. It was as if his mind had been erased of all history. Sheman looked down and found that he was wearing a pair of shorts, a t-shirt, and a pair of old comfortable leather sandals. He reached to his pocket, and although he really didn't know what that was, he just happened to be running his hands down the side of his body and felt something different. In his right pocket was a wad of folded paper and some type of fastener on it to keep the paper together. He thought, okay, I'll leave this in this area, perhaps it might be useful. After sitting down and gathering his wits about him, he decided to strike off into the direction directly in front of him. Of course, he had no idea where he was going, but he certainly didn't want to sit in this spot all day. He noticed it was a little hot and he began to sweat. He started off having no directional instruments to rely on, only his inner knowing telling him which way to go. Sheman had no past memory. He had no prior programming or conditioning of his beliefs, needs, or wants. He had never been around another human that he remembered, so he was strictly going by his intuition. After walking for a while, he saw something next to a rock. Sheman thought it looked rather odd. It had a metal shell-like body, one wheel on the front, and two wheels on the back, and two handles on the back. You would call this a wheelbarrow, but Sheman had no label for it since it had never been programmed into his awareness. However, his instincts were telling him to pick up each handle with his hands. He did this and saw that when he pushed the wheelbarrow forward, that the wheel turned and moved it forward as he moved forward. He thought, I'll take this along with me. Perhaps I might find another thing and other things that will be of interest, and I can carry them in this. Shaman continued along his path. After a while, he saw in a far distance a shape rising out of the sand. As he approached, he saw something that looked like it had been made out of propped up sticks of wood. He looked down at his feet and noticed that all along this structure there were hanging the same type of things he had on his feet. As he got closer, he saw someone similar to himself standing behind this heap of sticks. He looked the human up and down and noticed that his shoes were very shiny. The man behind the counter looked over at Shaman's feet and said, "You need some new shoes there, don't you, sir?" Shaman looked down at his feet and said, "I don't know. Do I?" "Yes," the vendor said, looking into his empty wheelbarrow. The vendor said, "Looks like it to me. Those are old and out of style. You will need about 5 pair." "Oh," said Shaman, and asked if he had a pair like the one the vendor was wearing. "Of course I do, and I just know your size," the vendor eluded. The vendor came around his stand and brought 5 pair out for Shaman. Shaman took 1 pair of the sandals and put them on. He stood up and looked down. They were very handsome indeed, with their shine, and he relayed to the vendor, "These sure are not as comfortable as the ones I had on." "Oh, they will be fine after a while. You just need to break them in, and you don't want someone else seeing you in those old, worn-out sandals, do you?" Shaman put the rest of the sandals in the wheelbarrow. Shaman responded, "I hadn't thought about it." The vendor asked for payment, and Shaman looked puzzled. The vendor held up a dollar bill, and Shaman recognized it from the right pocket, where he found the folded paper. Now Shaman knew this was money or some means of exchange. He handed the vendor his requested price and puts his old sandals along with the new ones into the wheelbarrow and goes on. After a while, Shaman sees another stand, and this one has food and drink. He stops and looks interestingly at what the vendor had. He selects several things, and the vendor tells him how much is required. Shaman pays the vendor his asking price and stops under a tree to sit down and eat and drink what he had purchased. Having no remembrance of food, this seemed to be an enjoyable experience. He went back for more and more. He just couldn't seem to get enough. The vendor happened to look down at his shoes and remarked at what a handsome set of sandals those were. Shaman smiled. Shaman, however, didn't show the vendor the blisters that the new sandals were rubbing on his feet. He thought to himself, perhaps I should put the old ones back on. They didn't do this. Then he remembered the comment of how nice they looked and the shoe vendor telling him how bad the old ones looked. He decided that he was tired of eating, even though the food and drink never seemed to quench the feeling of hunger and thirst. He continued walking for a distance and noticed another vendor. This vendor had shirts, and Sheman stopped to take a look. He looked at the vendor, and the vendor's shirt had shiny buttons, no wrinkles. The vendor looked at Sheman and told him, "You sure could use some new shirts? That one you have on is ugly and doesn't suit you." Sheman looked down and noticed that the comment made him feel bad about himself. He replied, "Do you think so, really?" The vendor nodded, "Mm-hmm. You need at least 7 shirts. If all you have in your wheelbarrow is what you have in this world." The vendor remarked. This made Sheman feel even worse. He looked at his wheelbarrow, and there were just the old sandals and 4 pair of new shoes lying there. "I guess you are right," remarked Sheman. "Give me 7 shirts." The vendor motioned for him to select what he wanted. But Sheman shook his head. He was afraid at this point that what he thought appropriate will not be handsome. He asked the vendor to select the shirts. Of course, the vendor selected the most expensive 7 shirts in his stand and smiled a mischievous smile as he took Sheman's money. Sheman suddenly felt hungrier than he had before. He walked on down the path to find another food vendor. He stopped briefly to put on one of the new shirts, since he was now concerned that he wasn't dressed appropriately to walk on the path. He put on his old t-shirt in the wheelbarrow with the old sandals, new shoes, and the other new shirts. He noticed right away that the shirt was scratchy and comfortable, but he put that out of his mind as the sandal rubbed another blister on his foot, and his stomach growled louder than before. He stopped at another food stand and bought mounds of food. He took his selections under the tree and sat next to his wheelbarrow to eat the food. The food again tasted good, but did not relieve his anger and his hunger. He looked down at his feet and saw how badly the sandals were treating his feet. And he put his hand on the back of his shirt collar to try find moments of peace from the tug that was scratching the back of his neck. Oh well, he told himself, I need to look appropriate. Don't I? The sandals were making it tougher and tougher to walk. So he decided the next tree that he came to that he would lie down for a while and close his eyes to rest. Another vendor, this time with a wheelbarrow himself, filled with shots, awakened Shaman. The vendor stopped and told Shaman how bad his shots looked. The vendor looked into Shaman's wheelbarrow and decided that Shaman needed at least 10 pairs of shorts, all different colors, to go with his 7 shirts. Shaman once again withdrew to himself further, with each passing comment that depicted some portion of his original clothing to be inappropriate. This made him feel so bad for these people who didn't even know him at all to tell him these negative things. This is just an awful place, Shaman began thinking to himself. Once again, as the wheelbarrow was filled with more clothes and things, he became hungrier and hungrier and angrier, and no amount of food seemed to make that hunger go away. Also now, each new vendor was telling Shaman that he better watch his wheelbarrow or somebody would steal his things from it. So each time that Shaman sat down, he drew his wheelbarrow closer and closer to him so that he will not have things stolen from his wheelbarrow. Shaman put on a pair of the new shorts. Again, they were not as comfortable as what he originally had, but scratched his skin and didn't really fit right. This made Shaman uncomfortable, but he didn't want others to think him inappropriately dressed. Their comments about his appearance were really making him self-conscious. His wheelbarrow was now getting heavier and heavier and harder to push because of all the stuff that was piled onto it. His feet were aching because of the new sandals. His skin was itching because of the shorts and the shirt, and he couldn't seem to get enough to eat or drink. He just wanted to cry. At each stop, he guarded his wheelbarrow so that no one would steal from him. And at each stop, and after each purchase, he became more miserable. The path was not flat anymore, but beginning to rise up in front of him. The wheelbarrow became harder and harder to push. At this point, his feet hurt so bad, and he just sat down next to the road and began to cry. A vendor happened by and told him how nice his shoes looked, and Shaman decided to try to walk a little further. He looked up into the sky for some reason, and the sun was bearing down so much. But all of a sudden, there seemed to be a slight breeze that brushed over his cheek. He thought he heard a whisper, but he shook his head and walked on. The road was becoming steeper now. He saw an old man along the path with no shoes and no shirt, and only wearing a ragged pair of shorts. The man looked frail and sad. Shaman stopped in front of the man. For some reason, Shaman felt another light breeze brush across his cheek, and a whisper, which he could barely hear, said, "Give." Shaman shook his head again, but looked puzzled for a moment, then looked back at the old man next to the road. "Your feet are bare. Would you like a pair of my sandals?" Shaman asked the old man. "Yes," the old man said. And Shaman took a pair from his wheelbarrow and handed them to the old man. The old man thanked him profusely and hugged him. Shaman noticed, as he handed the sandals to the old man, that he felt better. Shaman also noticed that he became less hungry with his action. Interesting, he thought. I wonder why, he said to himself as he shook his head. He started back along the steep path. This time, he saw a crying boy with nothing on lying next to the road. When Shaman stopped and asked, "What happened?" the boy told him, sobbing, that someone stopped him and took all of his fine clothes and left him for dead along the path. Hearing this, Shaman was puzzled. He thought to himself, this is such a cruel place to be. The breeze came again and whispered slowly, very low, "Give." Shaman looked down into his wheelbarrow and pulled out a shirt, shorts, and a pair of sandals and handed them to the boy. The boy was so surprised for someone to do him a kindness. He hugged him and thanked him. The boy then did something that Shaman had not seen anyone else do before. The boy looked up to the sky and said, "Thank you, Creator, for sending me help." Shaman was confused, but again, he felt a strange feeling of being less hungry and angry, and more at peace about himself. Next, he met an old woman on the path further up the hill. She too was completely naked, and Shaman just shook his head and said, what horrible person had done this to her? She explained to Shaman that she was robbed of all of her clothing and worldly possessions. She told Shaman that her belongings were in a wagon drawn by horses, and they were all taken, and she was left on the path for dead. Shaman looked in his wheelbarrow, pulled out a several pair of shorts and shirts and sandals and handed them to the lady. She was so tremendously grateful and began crying because his kindness had touched her so deeply. Shaman noticed almost instantly that he was really almost not hungry or thirsty or angry at all now. and almost felt like he was glowing from the inside out. Shaman was glad that he was able to help and looked down at his wheelbarrow that was almost empty. He saw his old shorts, shirt, and sandals and decided to stop and put them back on. He had decided that since the other people had been robbed of their fine clothes, that he would rather be wearing something less than fine in other people's eyes. The clothes felt so much more comfortable too. What a relief to have the fine ones off and the old ones back on. He began again. The clothes also seemed to have magic about them. They made him feel healed of all the negative comments that he had been receiving from all the vendors. He saw a ragged man sitting by the road. He stopped once again. He told the man that he would be glad to share what was left in his wheelbarrow if the man wanted them. He explained to the man that he had been wearing clothes, but he was welcomed to them if he liked. The man nodded and smiled, delighted to have something besides his one set of rags to cover his body. The old man took the last garments from the wheelbarrow and thanked him. Shaman heard the whisper again, "Give." He looked down into the wheelbarrow and found it empty. He thought to himself, "Give what?" Shaman offered the old man the wheelbarrow if he liked it, and the old man accepted it with much enthusiasm. As Shaman gave the last of his possessions away, the hunger and the thirst and the anger vanished. He turned to look after the old man with his wheelbarrow and saw it transform into a white dove and fly into the heavens. He thought of the small naked boy, the old man, the old women, and this gentleman. He looked into the heavens as he remembered the boy doing and feeling such an overwhelming rush of love, and yelled out to the skies, "Thank you, Creator!" The feelings he had from this experience were so refreshing and replenishing. Shaman felt as though he had eaten a full course meal and been hugged by thousands of people, all at one time. He couldn't believe how this felt. He turned to look at this path that he was on and noticed that he was at the top of the mountain. He walked to the edge and noticed that there were 4 white doves gliding together as they fly by. He felt once again a breeze upon his cheek and a whisper that said to him this time, "You are so very dearly loved for who you are." He sat down on the ground and then lay down in the grass beneath him, looking up into the sky. He just kept repeating to the heavens, "Thank you, Creator. Thank you, Creator. Thank you, Creator. He realized that he was no longer wanting and that what he came with was the most appropriate thing for him. He also sensed that the Creator put him here to have this experience so that he could learn that things are not what makes you happy. Giving is more important, and other people's opinion are not really of value. It is how you feel about who you are that truly counts. Anyone would like to share?